Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Why do you like scary stories? Not all of our experiences with fear look like those portrayed here. We haven't all met ghosts or had near-death experiences. But I do think we've all experienced fear, one way or another. And sometimes we've probably even enjoyed it. Enjoying it can look like seeing a scary movie, going through a haunted house, a roller coaster. Usually by the end of those, you get to feel resolved, and the adrenaline, the experience, feels good. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's why you're all here. I know it's why I am. Why we like scary stories. We get to feel that excitement of being terrified without taking any of the actual risk. And if I've learned anything from sharing these stories, your stories, it's that this beautiful world of ours comes with an abundance of horror. So, let's get started, shall we? I've been listening to your channel for a while now. I've always wished that I had a story of my own to send in, but I could never think of anything worth talking about. I never had any kind of paranormal encounter, stalker, or intruder to speak of. Then I heard the story about the people who survived a tornado in the gas station. And it really got me thinking, what's the most frightened I've ever been? And the answer was obvious: the house fire. When I was 9, my family lived a few miles outside of town, and our house was at the end of a curvy, mile-long driveway, so you couldn't really see it from the road. It was a 2-story with 5 bedrooms and 3 baths, so a fairly large but also pretty old house. In fact, it was built just after electrical wiring became standard, which happens to be how the fire started. My parents and baby sister slept on the ground floor, while my older brother and I stayed upstairs. We had a bathroom between us, and Dad's office was at the end of the hall. One November night, I woke to all of the smoke alarms sounding at once. It usually stayed cold in my room during that time of year, but I was so hot. I understood the smoke alarms were causing the noise, and I understood it was unreasonably hot when it shouldn't be. But never once did my brain consider those things meant our house was on fire. I was terrified. I knew something was horribly wrong, just not what. I was completely frozen in shock and confusion. If my brother hadn't burst into my room at that moment, I probably would have stayed in bed until it was too late. When he opened the door, clouds of dark smoke came with him, and it became nearly impossible to see or breathe. He was screaming something at me, but the rag that he held over his mouth made him impossible to understand. Eventually, he stopped trying to talk. Instead, he crawled over to me, grabbed my arm, and yanked me out of bed. Once we were both on the floor, he grabbed a shirt and quickly tied it around my face. Then he placed one of my hands onto his ankle, and for the rest of my life, I'll never forget the look in his eyes before he turned around. He conveyed his thoughts so clearly with that gaze that I sometimes forget he didn't speak actual words. But I heard him just as clearly as if he had. He was telling me to hold on for dear life, and that's exactly what I did. I couldn't even see our ceiling anymore. A layer of pure black smoke hovered just above our heads. And suddenly my safe childhood home was now a war zone. It felt like we crawled for miles before even making it into the hallway, and then the stairs were completely engulfed in flames. If I'd been alone and somehow made it that far, I don't think I would have gotten any further. I had no possible way out. In my child's mind, I pictured the smoke as existing only on the second floor. I had expected to crawl onto the stairs and make a run for the front door where we would meet our parents and sister, but that was no longer possible. My brother never hesitated. We've spoken of this night many times over the years, and I now know the sight of the stairs hadn't surprised him because he had already seen it. Jerry was 15 when this happened. Though he was still a child, he was much better equipped to handle the situation than myself. When he woke up to the smoke detectors, he immediately assumed the house was on fire and ran to his window. Everyone in the house believed all the windows were painted shut, except for Jerry. He foresaw a day when having a functional window might come in handy, so he had secretly been working on his. That's why he never even glanced at the staircase as we crawled past. He led me straight into his room and over to the window. When we were beneath it, he pulled me forward and pointed up. I shook my head no, so he went up first, and I watched in amazement as the collected smoke immediately began pouring out the open window. Jerry's legs disappeared over the ledge, and I once again froze with fear. But then a hand was clutching the back of my shirt and pulling me out of the stifling heat into the slightly less stifling air outside. House fires aren't like what you see on TV. In real life, you can feel the heat blasting all over your skin. It actually feels like it's crawling on you. On TV, the hero throws their arms over their face and runs inside to rescue the scared child. No, nuh-uh. That's not how it is. You can barely keep your eyes open. The heat is that intense. Most people probably couldn't force themselves to enter an area blasting that kind of heat. The only way you get there is by being trapped from within, and then every fiber of your being is screaming for you to get out. I think back to how my brother had to cross his room, get through the hallway, open my door, and then come pull me out of bed. And I just don't know how he did it. I understand why he lingered at the door. What was normally only a few steps might as well have been a mile. And he knew he'd have to get me all the way back to his window, too. I really don't know if I could have done it had our roles been reversed. Had I been able to just go out my window, would I have even thought about him? He thinks that I would have. He says I can't understand that kind of moment without living it, and I'll always have the perspective of a frightened child, while he'll always have the perspective of a frightened older brother who knew his parents couldn't help. We might as well have been on our own planet. I'll never forget anything about that night, but I especially remember the sound of my mother's cry when she saw us emerge from the window. Jerry pulled me all the way to the roof's ledge and dangled me over the side. My dad got beneath me, and I fell into his waiting arms, but Jerry was too big to catch. He hung from the side to get his feet as close to the ground as possible, and Dad tried to slow his fall, but it was still a hard drop. The doctors think Dad might have actually made it a little worse. Jerry's left ankle absorbed the brunt of the impact, and he was in a cast for 6 weeks. This was all happening in the middle of the night. We had no phone, no car keys or flashlights. We thought that we would be stuck watching our house burn to the ground while waiting for daylight. But the fire truck showed up about 25 minutes later. The blaze had grown big enough to spot from the road, and a police officer happened to pass by. He was able to call it in immediately and get help on the way. So yeah, that was definitely the most terrifying experience of my life. And thank you all for listening. When I was in the 4th grade, I spent spring break with my grandparents in Arizona. They lived in a pretty sleepy area, being retired and all. A short golf cart ride away, there was lots of golf courses, random activity centers, but mostly right around them is just desert. They did their best to keep me entertained, taking us to spring training games, dinosaur museums, a pretty cool zoo. We spent a good amount of time at my grandparents' actual house, though, which I quite enjoyed because they had a pool. Between that and my Nintendo DS, I managed to keep myself pretty busy, spending a good majority of time in that pool. Grandma was a smoker and a night owl, so she was often outside puffing away while I'd be swimming away. One night I was out there alone. my grandparents watching one of their shows inside. At some point, my grandma must have come outside because when I looked over toward the back door, I saw her sitting there. It was a little off, though. She hadn't turned on the porch light and was essentially sitting in the dark. But I just kept swimming. Maybe she didn't plan on being out there long. The skies are pretty clear out there, so one of my favorite things to do was to float on my back and look up at the stars. While on my back, I feel something brush against my foot, and before I can react, something is grabbing my ankle. And I mean, I felt the feeling of a bony yet human hand. It wrapped around my ankle. It startled me for sure. Up to this point, my grandparents hadn't gone in the pool, but in the event that it was my grandma, I refrained from kicking my feet around. I positioned myself to stand in the pool, expecting to see my grandma, but I saw no one. As far as I could tell, I was alone, but I didn't feel like it. It felt like someone was watching me. Then there was my ankle. I could still recall the sensation. Within moments of realizing I was completely alone, I decided to go inside. When I opened the back door, I startled my grandparents, both of them saying that they had no idea I was out there, that I was so quiet. But hadn't you heard me or seen me, Grandma? I saw you out there, sitting in the dark like a creep, I joked. Only she didn't laugh. She turned around and looked at me, saying that she hadn't gone out for her smoke. Not yet. I remember contemplating telling them about my ankle, or insisting I saw someone out there, but I didn't end up saying anything, except the next day, I did ask if they ever got any critters around here, and did anything ever get in the pool. They got weird. It's hard to explain, but they looked at each other in a way that made even me, a fourth grader, feel like they were hiding something. They told me no. Well, one did, while the other said, "Not really." Not really? What the heck did that mean? I kept wondering if they knew something. I really couldn't let it go, mentally. But they never said anything else about it, so neither did I. Until I got home, maybe 2 or 3 days after the whole thing. My older brother Luke, 19 at the time, was visiting from college for his spring break. One night, my family is outside by the fire eating. Parents are drinking, and Luke asks what I did for spring break. So I told him. He instantly starts laughing when I get to the swimming part, and he says something about that being gnarly. Which part, though? I was confused because I hadn't even told him about the weird thing, the part about my ankle or the person. My parents attempted to hush him from saying what he was trying to say, but he wasn't going to not tell me what was so gnarly. So he tells my parents, "Oh, that's messed up, you didn't tell him," all while still laughing. And then he says it. "You know an old dude died in there, right? Like last year, one of Grandma and Grandpa's parties, he just died in there. Heart attack or something. One of their friends." My parents were scolding my brother for laughing, and then my mom started scolding him for scaring me. Apparently, I hadn't moved or so much as reacted to what my brother had said. I was sort of in shock. I knew that I'd swam in the pool nonstop. I also knew something else, something no one else around me knew. Something was in that pool. Something was outside. I tried to shake it off, and I told my brother, whatever, chlorine kills all that anyways. I'd learned that from Grandpa himself when he'd treat the pool. But I could never really reconcile it all. I mean, the story my brother tells is unsettling, but the story I didn't tell, it's something I can't really explain. Even as an adult in my 20s, I don't understand it. Was it this guy's spirit? If so, since when can you feel that kind of stuff? Can you really be touched by ghosts? It seems so unreal, yet I have no other explanation for it. I wanted to see if anyone else has heard of pond pixies. You may know them by another name. I only know what my grandma called them. And since she's been dead for almost 15 years, I can't exactly ask any follow-up questions. She used to tell me all kinds of stories, but that's all I thought they were, stories. Growing up, my grandparents bought lots of land, which included a large pond. When my grandfather died, we moved our trailer onto that land so that Dad could help Grandma take care of it. As I got older, I wanted to bring friends over so we could go fishing and swimming, but Grandma said it was too dangerous. She didn't even like us getting too close to the water because it might anger the pond pixies. Her words, not mine. According to her, pond pixies are small, humanoid fish creatures. Imagine a fairy-sized mermaid. And they live in ponds all over the world. Their bottom half closely resembles that of a tadpole, and their top halves are merely humanoid, not human. They have 2 arms, bluish-greenish skin, bald heads, big mouths and no teeth, and little black orbs for eyes. They're also amphibious and contain a set of gills on either side of their flat noses. They usually want nothing to do with humans. As long as we keep to ourselves, they keep to themselves. But if we swim in their pond or steal their fish, they become angry and vengeful. They won't attack you directly, but they'll curse you, and awful things will happen to you and those closest to you. I didn't see anything online that fully matched this description, but there's so much contradicting information on Google, I wish I'd never looked. How am I supposed to know which site to believe? That's why I decided it was probably best to just tell my story and see what people said. When Grandma would tell me these stories, she would talk about a little girl she grew up with named Ellie. They were the same age and lived on neighboring farms with a large pond that stretched across both properties. One night, Grandma and Ellie were sitting under a tree near the water. They watched as Ellie's little brother walked out of the barn and began to pee in the pond. Grandma looked away, embarrassed, and she saw one of the creatures in the moonlight. Its top half was visible above the water's surface, and it was watching the boy. Before Grandma could alert her friend, it disappeared back into the murky depths. When Ellie's brother had gone, Grandma described the creature, and her friend became very upset. She told Grandma all about the pond pixies and said that they would punish her whole family for what her brother had done. The girl ran straight home to tell her parents, and her mother sent the brother back with 2 boxes of sweetbread by the way of an apology. 2 days later, her brother fell out of the hayloft and broke both of his legs. The family was positive the pixies caused the accident, and they were grateful his life was spared. Grandma was always very serious when telling this story, and God help anyone who made a joke out of it. But I never believed the pixies were actually real until a recent chain of awful events. These days, my grandmother and parents are dead. The whole property is mine, and I hadn't thought about the pond pixies since I was a kid. Then my boyfriend invited a few buddies over for an evening of fishing and beer. Things were pretty tame, until I went to bed. At some point after that, one of the friends, a guy who does construction work, goes to his truck and produces a stick of what looks like dynamite. He put it in some kind of container, lit it, and threw it in the middle of our pond. Whatever that stuff was, it wasn't as strong as actual dynamite, but it still made an explosion, like a bundle of Chinese fireworks on steroids. The water level noticeably dropped, and it killed more than a dozen fish and frogs, along with a couple of snakes and a turtle. I was so angry about our pond and the wildlife, I never thought about the pixies until the following day. My boyfriend got a call late that afternoon. His friend's house had a gas leak. He, his wife, and their 2 children died in their sleep. A neighbor went to check on them when the kids missed their bus. Police called it a freak accident. My boyfriend, he had another buddy out there that night too. A couple of days later, he was involved in a car accident that broke his arm in 2 places. He had to have a metal rod inserted to hold the bones together. As for my boyfriend, I think he got off the easiest. He was sober enough to fear my reaction, and he tried to stop them. But he did lose his wallet that weekend. Right after cashing his paycheck. He gets paid every 2 weeks, so that was half-month's salary gone, just like that. I was always on his ass about walking around with cash, so at least he doesn't do that anymore. Hell, maybe it's all just one big coincidence. All I know for sure is that I'm glad I went to bed when I did. Basically, I only know what my grandma told me and what happened to our friends. The rest is up for debate, and I'm open to pretty much any and all theories at this point. So, lay 'em on me. Late last night, I was smoking a cigarette on my back deck. The sky was clear, the stars were bright, everything was normal. Then a small, bright green light suddenly shot through the sky and fell to the ground somewhere in the forest behind my house. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood there wondering how much people paid for meteorites, how hard it would be to break into pieces. I was already thinking about little meteor earrings and keychains, along with what name I would use on Etsy. I thought they'd for sure sell like hotcakes. Once your mind starts adding up pretend money, it gets really easy to explain away any hurdles. That weird green light I saw? That was merely the color of flame that crash-landing space rocks always produce. Nothing more. I tell myself. Had it been daytime, or if I hadn't been alone or terrified of the dark forest, I probably would have gone looking for it right that minute. But I decided to wait for morning. I don't have any neighbors, and it was already close to 1 a.m. I saw no risk in letting it cool for a few hours. After making a mental note of the direction it landed, I went inside and excitedly finished preparing for bed. But it was useless. I tossed and turned for almost 2 hours before accepting that I was too excited to sleep. It was almost 4 by then, so I went to make some coffee while scouring eBay and Etsy for other meteorite sellers. Had I thought to do that from the start, I probably would have gotten some sleep. I'm not sure why I believed that prices would be so much higher, but I was way off the mark. It was still worth doing, but it wasn't the cash cow I'd worked myself up to thinking it would be. After finishing my coffee, I placed my mug in the sink and stood looking out the kitchen window for a moment, just lost in thought. It faces the back deck in the spot where I was planning to enter the forest. As I was turning away, I saw movement behind the tree line. It made me realize that I hadn't thought about the fact that I might run into a bear. I tried to locate the source of movement, but it was still too dark to see well. There was only enough light to make out the most basic shapes and shadows through the dense overgrowth, but that was enough. I almost gave up at one point, but thank God I didn't. I still can't think about how close I was to going out there without having a full-blown panic attack. I feel crazy insisting that this thing could have been human, but something was moving through the forest, just on the other side of the tree line. It moved as freely and smoothly as if it had been walking through my backyard. It never stumbled or paused to move around obstructions. It just kept going, as if it were passing straight through the overgrowth. And it was tall. Oh my God, it was so tall. It had to be well over 7 feet, if not more. And thin, too. Unnaturally thin. Had there been more light, I feel like I could have seen every bone in its body. It was definitely walking on 2 legs, and I think it had 2 long arms, but again, it was just too hard to see to be certain. Its flesh, or whatever covers its body, was as white as the bones I should have been able to see. I only saw it from a side profile, but if it had a nose, it was so small you couldn't see it from that angle. It just kept walking, straight past my house without stopping or looking around, and once it was out of sight, I didn't see it again. Of course, I didn't go looking for it either. I knew that no one would believe me. I would sound like a lunatic if I tried to call the police or tell my friends. So I closed all the blinds, didn't leave my house for 3 days. I've lived here for almost 20 years. I've never seen or experienced anything remotely close to this before now. The entire story sounds like the ramblings of a drug addict, or the beginning of one losing their mind. But I haven't so much as smoked weed in over 10 years, and I've never touched any other drugs in my life. As far as being senile, well, I'm getting old, but I'm not even 50 yet, so what does that leave? I feel like the creature and the thing falling from the sky, they could have been connected, right? Because what are the odds that they aren't? What are the chances that both impossible things just so happen to occur within a few hours of each other? I hate to actually come out and say it, but the only explanation I can think of is that an alien crashed its ship near my house. However, I would really like if that weren't the case, so any alternative theories would be greatly appreciated. Seriously, any at all. It's the Cold War, late 1950s. My paternal grandfather, Ivan, who'd recently obtained his membership into the labor union, is fired from his job manufacturing farm products for wholesale and trade. One day, the bosses pull him into their office. 2 local detectives are also standing in the room. The 4 men sit Ivan down and unlawfully interrogate him for hours before handing him his termination papers to sign. At this time, Congress had implemented sweeping investigations in order to catch any suspected communist spies in the government, or labor unions, the entertainment industry, and military forces. In part, as the tension grew between the 2 nations, the labor unions began terminating anyone who had ever belonged to, or had ever been sympathetic to, the Communist Party. Ivan Petrov was born an American citizen, but on paper he fit the description his management was told to get rid of. His parents immigrated to New York in 1909, just before the war started. Ivan was devastated. He'd break the news to my paternal grandmother, a woman named Kate, later that night. Kate would break the news that she's pregnant with my mother that night as well. Kate got to share her news first, which made Ivan feel all the worse when delivering his. The predicted due date became a timer for Ivan to get back on his feet, 6 months to find stable ground for him and his family. He starts working odd jobs in the city, staying out at all times of the night. After a month of this routine, he's made just enough for rent and groceries. Early into the next month, Ivan arrives home with a small Emerson radio. He'd spent $50 on it, which could be about $475 in today's money. This purchase depleted most of their savings, and Kate couldn't believe he'd wasted money on such a frivolous thing. But Ivan reassures her this radio will solve all their money problems. Now, along with odd jobs, Ivan would also stay up all night, clicking through the frequencies of the radio. Kate would wake up to see him sitting at the kitchen table with the radio pressed against his ear, occasionally scribbling down numbers onto a piece of paper laid out in front of him. When she'd ask what he was doing, Ivan told her that he could hear someone talking to him through the radio. He said they'd given him the final score of a minor league baseball game that takes place tomorrow. The radio told him to go to the betting hall and put everything he's got on the Brooklyn Dodgers against the Giants, with a score of 7-6. Kate begs Ivan not to go, but the next morning, he's gone before she wakes up. Their savings have been cleared out, the empty box that once held their future discarded next to the radio. He wouldn't return home until the next morning. When he walked through the door, Kate had fallen asleep on the couch. She's woken up with a large leather bag being tossed onto the carpet in front of her. It spills over, and a waterfall of cash slides out. Kate opens her eyes and sees over $10,000 spread across the floor. Ivan tells her he'd won the bet that was placed on the baseball game. Soon after that, they moved into a better part of town, a third-floor condo with a room for the baby. Ivan continues doing odd jobs. Kate's 6 months pregnant. She finds him on another night sitting in the kitchen with the radio pressed against his ear. Same position, same frantic scribbling. This time, Ivan doesn't wait until morning. He doesn't see Kate watching him through the doorway as he proceeds to collect his coat and then exit by trying to close the door as quietly as possible. Kate waited until she heard Ivan leave the driveway before approaching the radio left on the table. She lifted it up and clicked it on. There was a buzz of noise before the station went quiet. She couldn't hear anything when she moved up and down the station ladder. Then Ivan came back inside to grab something he'd forgotten. When he saw Kate with the radio, he became enraged. Grabbing it from her hands, he threatened her with death if she ever touched the radio again. Kate had never seen this side of Ivan before. She cried and ran back into their bedroom, slamming the door. Shortly after her slam, Ivan would match its force on their front door when he left. When she came back out, the radio was gone. Another long 24 hours would pass before Ivan returned home. With him, another large sum of cash. When he sees Kate, she apologizes for touching the radio. He asks if she turned it on when she was holding it, and she says yes, and then asks if the voices talked to her. She said no, she couldn't hear anything. Ivan reminds her of his previous warning, then tells her to get dressed because they're going out to dinner. His glare makes her reserve the question that she has for another time. Kate got dressed, and they went to a fancy restaurant in Brighton Beach. Their interactions together don't feel normal anymore. 2 more months would pass with Ivan's schedule unchanged. Kate's 8 months pregnant now. One morning, after a particularly long stint away from home, Ivan comes in the door sweating, his eyes wide, darting in all directions. He looked like a madman running from window to window, closing all of the shades and curtains. Then he ran from room to room, turning off all the lights in the house. When Kate asks him what's wrong, he says that he's got people after him. He says the radio gave him a message, telling him everything about their plan. None of what he's saying makes any sense to Kate. She asks who. He said Truman's boys, then tells her they can't talk loud. Before she can ask another question, Ivan pushed the couches in front of the front door. Then he started taping newspaper to the window so no light would get in. When the living room was completely dark, Ivan and Kate would sit together on the floor behind the couch. He'd get up to retrieve a box from the closet that Kate hadn't noticed before. When he opened the box, what was inside made Kate's heart drop. Under some papers was a 9mm handgun. When he pulled it out, the box clinked around. A handful of extra bullets rolled around in the bottom of the cardboard, along with the already full clip he'd taken out of the gun to show Kate. Then he pops it back in, and he hands the gun to her. At first, she doesn't take it, but he shoves it at her, saying, "They know about you too. They'll probably want you dead too." Kate still doesn't take the gun, so he leaves it on the floor next to her, gets up, and goes over to the closet to get a second gun that he's had stashed in there. Seeing Ivan with a gun and having no clue what to expect next, Kate grabs the gun sitting next to her. He grabs the radio before coming back to sit next to her. Sitting in dark silence, Kate watches as Ivan presses the radio against his ear and pans up and down through the frequencies. A muffled car door shuts somewhere outside, and a dog starts barking. Ivan grabs his gun and drops the radio. Kate tries to reassure him that it's the neighbors. She reminds him that they have a dog. Ivan should know this information, but he stays back against the couch with his finger on the trigger. Hours would pass. When either of them would need to use the restroom, they'd have to crawl from the living room to the hallway before getting up. Kate is 8 months pregnant and struggling to stay on the ground all night, but Ivan tells her that she has to stay out of sight. Every time he reaches for the radio, Ivan looks at the clock, and every time he looks at the clock, he becomes more worried. Then, as Kate begins to drift off, her eyes are closed when she hears Ivan turn off the radio and set it on the floor next to him. He kisses her forehead, and she hears him get up. He's not crawling. She hears him walk into the baby's room near the entrance of the hallway. She hears Ivan tearing down the newspaper he'd put up earlier that day. Then she hears the wooden window frame shake and creak open. She could hear wind blowing in. After a moment, she hears a distant impact. That's when Kate gets up, runs into the baby's room. It's empty. Kate runs over to the open window and looks out to see Ivan, motionless on the sidewalk below. Investigators would rule Ivan's death as suicide. While looking for clues, they'd inspect the radio and find transmitters connected to the wiring inside. They'd also tell Kate that Ivan is a member of a small Soviet resistance group. Its members mostly made up of rich Russian immigrants with mob ties in New York and New Jersey. They were getting their orders from somewhere across the water while sending back government information they found. When Ivan was fired from his job, he was lost and angry. He'd met others that held his beliefs and similar situations at a bar that he'd visit. The visits became meetings, and Ivan got involved with a group who, at the time in our American history, didn't want peace. They were terroristic in their ideas of action and were slowly gathering members across the seas in America to stage an attack within. Kate had no idea that Ivan was part of this movement. They'd become strangers to each other in the relationship. This was a landslide that Kate couldn't climb back from. With her life in ruins and a baby on the way, Kate moved back in with her parents. She'd give birth to my mother in December and give her up for adoption. But not before writing this story out to my grandparents, Mom's adoptive parents, before they took her home to Virginia. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me tonight, whether it's your first time or you're a regular. Your support means the world over here. We've got a brand new episode every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough to find those new deep sleep videos. And of course, double features every Sunday and Wednesday. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. A huge shout out to all of our patrons whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.